Faced with her husband's divorce and his plans to marry his mistress, Alara requests one last night together. He agrees on the condition they use protection to prevent the pregnancy they'd always longed for. But in a final, desperate gambit to save their family, Alara uses intimacy as a weapon, weaving a web of pleasure so powerful it makes him forget everything, even his own rules. Hello, bestie. Please stay with me as I unfold this interesting romantic story. If you enjoy the story, please support us by subscribing to this channel and hit the notification button for more. Thank you. Grab your popcorn, sit back, relax, and enjoy this story. The verdict came not from a judge's bench, but across a lawyer's polished mahogany desk. The air smelled of lemon-scented polish and regret. Alara traced the grain of the wood with her eyes, refusing to look at Marcus as the attorney droned on about asset division and spousal support. 15 years. It ended with a signature, a quiet scratch of a pen that echoed louder than any slammed door. Marcus, ever the gentleman in his cruelty, waited until they were in the parking lot. I'm sorry, Alara. Cynthia, she's just different. It's not your fault. The name Cynthia hung between them, the final, elegant knife twist. Alara simply nodded, her composure a brittle shell. She drove home to the house that was now only hers, the silence within a physical weight. The key turned in the lock with a finality that echoed through the empty hall. The house, once a symphony of shared life, the low hum of Marcus' evening news, the clatter of their dinner preparations, the soft rustle of pages as they read together on the couch, was now a tomb of silence. Alara leaned against the heavy oak door, the cold wood a stark contrast to the feverish heat of her own skin. The brittle composure shed maintained in the lawyer's office, in the parking lot, crumbled away, leaving her raw and exposed. She moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting her own life. The living room held the indentation of his body on his favorite leather armchair. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the coffee had brewed that morning, a bitter, acrid scent that now seemed to symbolize their end. But it was the door at the end of the hallway that drew her, a magnetic pull she was powerless to resist. She pushed it open. The room was bathed in the soft, golden light of the late afternoon sun, dust motes dancing in the slanted rays. It was the nursery that never was. They had painted it together, a hopeful, buttery yellow. Sunshine, Marcus had declared, wiping a smear of paint from her cheek with his thumb. She could still feel the ghost of that touch, so full of love and promise. They had argued over cribs. He wanted modern. She preferred the vintage white sleigh bed they'd eventually found at a flea market. It stood in the corner now, a silent, aching monument to their failure, still wrapped in the same clear plastic sheet from the day they'd assembled it. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, the plush, unused carpet yielding beneath her. She pulled her legs to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as if to hold herself together. Her eyes scanned the room, each object a fresh stab of pain. On a shelf sat a lonely, hand-knitted teddy bear from her mother, its glass eyes seeming to hold a perpetual question. In the closet, untouched, were tiny onesies they'd bought on a whim during a vacation, a secret, hopeful purchase they'd giggled over. The mobile of felt stars and moons hung motionless above the crib, waiting for a breeze, for a breath, for a life that never came. 5 years. 5 years of temperature charts, of ovulation kits lined up on the edge of the bathtub, of doctor's appointments that filled them with dread and hope in equal measure. The devastating miscarriage that had shattered them at 12 weeks. The subsequent, soul-crushing silence from her womb, year after year. The pressure had become a third person in their marriage, a cold, judgmental presence that slithered into their bed at night. Their lovemaking had transformed from an act of passion into a clinical, scheduled duty, fraught with unspoken expectations and the inevitable, crushing disappointment each month. She saw it now, how he had begun to flinch from her touch, how the love in his eyes had been slowly replaced by a helpless pity, and finally, by a distant resignation. Cynthia hadn't stolen him. The emptiness of this yellow room had driven him away. Cynthia was simply uncomplicated. She represented a future unburdened by grief, by failure, by the silent, accusing presence of a dream that never came true. A dry, ragged sob escaped Alara's throat, echoing in the hollow room. She pressed her forehead against the side of the crib, the cool plastic a shock against her skin. This room was their story's greatest tragedy. And as she sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of the children they would never have, a new emotion began to burn through the grief, hot and sharp and terrifying. It was not despair. It was a furious, defiant rage. He thought he could just walk away from this, from them, from the future they had painted on these very walls. Her gaze lifted, settling on the empty crib. No, the final chapter of their story would not be written in a lawyer's office. It would not end with Marcus building a new family with someone else while this room remained a shrine to their failure. A plan, audacious and dangerous, began to form in the depths of her despair. It was a gamble with the highest of stakes, a final, desperate roll of the dice using the only currency she had left. The intimate knowledge of 15 years, and the memory of a man who had once looked at her as if she held the entire sun in her hands. She would not let him go without a fight. The battle for their future would begin in the ruins of its nursery. The silence of the house was no longer a weight. It was a cocoon. Alara did not move from her spot on the nursery floor for a long time, letting the tidal wave of grief wash over her, through her, until she felt scraped raw and empty. The tears came then, not as sobs, but as a silent, relentless river that soaked the knees of her dress and left salty tracks in the dust on the floor. She cried for the children who would never call her mother. She cried for the man who had once looked at her as if she hung the moon. She cried for the future that had been meticulously planned on this very floor, now reduced to legal documents and the scent of another woman's perfume on her husband's collar. And then, as suddenly as it began, the tears stopped. The emptiness they left behind was not a void. It was a forge. A single, scalding memory flashed behind her eyes. Marcus in the parking garage, his voice not cruel, but pitying. "Cynthia, she understands me." The words were no longer a knife to the heart. They were a spark to tinder. Understands him? A bitter, metallic taste filled her mouth. What does she understand? His favorite brand of scotch? The way he likes his eggs scrambled? She understood the pressure he was under at work? Alara almost laughed. A harsh, broken sound in the silent room. She understood the man who had held her hair back when she was sick with a flu that turned into pneumonia. She understood the boy who cried at their wedding, overwhelmed with joy. She understood the grieving father who had built this crib with his own hands, his knuckles white with a hope he was too afraid to voice aloud. She understood the silent language of his body in the dark, a language they had written together over 15 years. Cynthia understood a curated version of him, a man unburdened by history and loss. She understood the escape. Rage ignited, a clean, hot flame that burned away the last of her self-pity. It was not a blind rage. It was a focused, clarifying fury. He didn't get to do this. He didn't get to walk away from their shared history, their shared failure, and build something new and shiny while she was left to dust the ghosts in this yellow room. Her eyes lifted, scanning the space. The crib, the mobile, the lonely teddy bear. This room was their battlefield, and she had just been handed her enemy's strategy. Marcus was a man governed by emotion, by a desire to avoid pain and seek comfort. He had fled the hard, aching reality of their infertility for the easy, uncomplicated solace Cynthia offered. He was not a villain, he was weak, and weakness was predictable. A plan began to unspool in her mind, audacious, perilous, and born of absolute desperation. It was a gamble with the highest possible stakes, using the only weapons she had left. Intimate knowledge and a love so twisted by betrayal it had sharpened into a blade. He was coming tomorrow for the last of his things. He would be guilty, sentimental, and vulnerable. She would not fight him. She would not plead. She would remind him. She would remind him not of the doctor's appointments and the negative tests, but of the heat that had existed long before the coldness set in. She would remind him of the connection that had once been so potent it felt like a physical force. She would use every secret she knew, every vulnerability he had ever shared in the dark, every mapped pathway to his pleasure, and she would weaponize it. The objective was not to wound his new life. It was to obliterate its very foundation in his mind. It was to make the memory of her, of them, so overpowering that the thought of Cynthia would feel like a pale, cheap imitation. And the ultimate prize? The one thing that had broken them could be the very thing that saved them. The risk was astronomical. If she failed, the humiliation would be absolute. But as she looked around the room at the ghost of the family she had always wanted, Alara knew she had nothing left to lose. The ashes of her old life were still warm, and from them, a new, terrifying resolve began to rise. She stood up, her legs stiff but steady. She walked out of the nursery and closed the door firmly behind her. Not on the dream, but on the despair. She had a campaign to plan. Her last stand would not be a defeat. It would be an ambush. The morning of Marcus' arrival dawned bright and clear, a cruel mockery of the storm that had raged within Alara all night. She had slept little, her mind rehearsing the coming encounter like a director blocking a scene. Every move, every word, every glance was choreographed. Her grief had been sandpapered away, leaving behind a core of polished, determined steel. She moved through the house with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She did not clean or tidy. The evidence of his departure, the empty spaces on the bookshelves, the bare hook where his favorite robe had hung, were useful props in her play. They spoke of an ending which was precisely the narrative she needed to sell. Her preparation was meticulous. She chose her armor not from a wardrobe of power suits, but from the history they shared. The silk chemise was the color of a twilight sky, a whisper-soft memory of a weekend in Paris early in their marriage, a time of uncomplicated passion. She applied her makeup with a light hand, enough to accentuate her features but not to mask the faint shadows under her eyes, a testament to a sorrow that would make his guilt flare. She spritzed on the perfume he had always loved. The one Head once said smelled like moonlight and gardens. The doorbell rang at precisely 10 o'clock. She took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the calm of the eye of the hurricane settle over her. She was no longer a woman about to beg for her husband back. She was a siren preparing to sing a ship onto the rocks. She opened the door. Marcus stood there, looking uncomfortable in his own skin, clutching a folded moving box. He was already dressed in the sharper, more contemporary style Cynthia likely favored. "Alara," he said, his voice too bright, too formal. "I just came for the rest of my books and the things from my study." "Of course," she said, her voice soft, devoid of accusation. She stepped back to let him in. "It's all boxed up in the hall." He nodded, avoiding her eyes, and moved past her into the living room. The air thickened with everything left unsaid. He began to busy himself with the books, his movements stiff and efficient. Alara watched him for a moment, leaning against the doorframe, allowing him to feel the weight of her gaze. "It's strange," she murmured, not quite to him, "how 15 years can be reduced to a few boxes." He paused, a hardback volume in his hand. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed. "Alara." "Don't." "I'm not," she said, and her tone was so gentle it made him finally look at her. She offered a small, sad smile. "I'm not trying to start a fight. I've accepted it, Marcus." The lie was smooth and cool as river stone. "It just feels unfinished. It ended in a lawyer's office. It deserves more than that." He swallowed, his guilt a visible aura around him. "What more is there?" This was the moment. The air stilled. She pushed herself off the doorframe and took a few steps into the room, letting the silk of her chemise whisper against her skin. A subtle sound in the quiet room. She stopped a few feet from him, well within his personal space, forcing him to truly see her, not as his soon-to-be ex-wife, but as the woman he had loved for half his life. "Before you go," she said, her voice dropping to an intimate register meant for bedrooms and secrets. One last time. She saw the immediate shock in his eyes, the automatic refusal forming on his lips. She pressed on, her gaze holding his. "A proper goodbye to us, to what we were. Not this clinical severing." He stared, utterly blindsided. His eyes flickered over her, taking in the chemise, the familiar scent of her perfume, the vulnerability she was projecting so masterfully. Desire, potent and confused, warred with guilt and caution on his face. "Alara," he breathed, a protest and a plea. "It's not a good idea. It's over." "Is it?" she asked, her head tilting slightly. "Or are we just stopping? There's a difference." She took one final step closer, well within his reach. 15 years deserves a better ending than a signature on a document. It deserves a memory. She saw the exact moment his resistance broke. It was in the slight parting of his lips, the dilation of his pupils, the way his body leaned infinitesimally toward hers instead of away. Her words had framed it not as a desperate act, but as a romantic, poignant ritual. A final chapter to honor the story. He was a man who valued narratives, and she had just handed him a profoundly seductive one. He didn't speak. He simply gave one slow, agonized, and utterly complicit nod. The siren's song had found its mark. The ship was turning toward the rocks. The air in the room, once thick with the dust of endings, was now charged with a new, dangerous electricity. Marcus' nod hung between them, a silent pact that had shifted the very foundations of the house. The space that separated them, which had felt like a canyon moments before, now seemed to hum with proximity. He reached for her then, his movement hesitant, as if touching a precious artifact head already broken. His hand came up to cradle her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek with a familiarity that made her heart clench with a genuine, unexpected pain. This was the man she had loved. This was the touch she had built her life around. For a terrifying second, the mask of the seductress slipped, and she was just Alara, losing her husband. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, allowing herself one brief moment of real sorrow. It was this raw, unscripted emotion that sold the performance more than any calculated move ever could. Then, as his head began to lower toward hers, she placed a gentle, halting hand on his chest. His heart hammered against her palm, a frantic rhythm that belied his controlled exterior. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, which was now dark with a confused and guilty desire. "Marcus," she said, her voice a soft, breathy thing that was both invitation and caution. "Wait," he stilled, his brow furrowing. The romantic narrative she had spun was so potent, so perfectly tailored to his sentimental nature, that any interruption felt like a discordant note. He was ready to lose himself in the goodbye. He was prepared for passion, for tears, for a cathartic end. He was not prepared for pragmatism, especially not from her. She took a small half-step back, creating a sliver of space, a buffer for the negotiation she was about to begin. She let her hands slide from his chest, a slow, lingering touch that maintained the connection even as she introduced the boundary. "We have to be smart about this," she said, her eyes wide and earnest, as if she were the one being responsible for the both of them. She voiced the fear she knew was lurking in the back of his mind, the one thing that could make him bolt. Protection. The word landed between them, clinical and cold, dousing the heated moment in a splash of reality. Marcus flinched as if Shed struck him. The guilt she had been stoking so carefully now flooded his features, raw and unmistakable. He looked almost ashamed that she had to be the one to say it, that she had to be the one to acknowledge the other woman, the new life, the consequences that waited for him outside this door. "Alara, he stammered, his voice thick. "I can't." He didn't finish the sentence. "I can't have a child with you now, when I'm starting a new life with her." The unspoken words were louder than if Head shouted them. They were the entire reason for the divorce papers, for the empty closet, for the boxes in the hall. They were the chasm that had opened between them. And Alara, with the precision of a surgeon, stepped right up to its edge and pretended to look down in fear. "I know," she whispered, her voice laced with a resigned sadness that was only half feigned. She gave a slow, understanding nod, playing the part of the reasonable, defeated wife to perfection. Of course, it wouldn't be fair to anyone. She was agreeing with him, She was validating his fear, soothing his panic, and in doing so, she was disarming him completely. He had been braced for a fight, for hysterics, for a desperate attempt to trap him. Her calm, logical acceptance was the one thing he hadn't anticipated. It made him feel safe. It made him feel in control of a situation that was, in truth, entirely of her making. The relief that washed over his face was palpable. The tension in his shoulders eased. He looked at her with a newfound respect, even gratitude. In his eyes, she was being strong, she was being mature. She was giving him the clean, uncomplicated ending he thought he wanted. He had no idea that the cage door had just clicked shut. Of course, he echoed, his voice softer now, full of a twisted kind of gratitude. The condition had been set, the rule established. In his mind, the risk was mitigated. The game could now proceed. Elara offered him a small, bittersweet smile, a brave face put on for his benefit. Inside, her mind was cold and clear. The first and most crucial hurdle had been cleared. He had agreed to her terms, believing they were his own. She had given him the illusion of control, and in doing so, she had taken all of it for herself. The clinical word, protection, had done its job. It had built a flimsy wall of safety in Marcus' mind, a permission slip for the transgression he was about to commit. The tension that had momentarily fractured the mood now melted away, replaced by a new, more urgent charge. The negotiation was over. The terms were set. Now there was only the act. But as Marcus moved to kiss her again, his touch now more assured, more entitled, Elara shifted the narrative once more. She would not be a passive participant in this farewell. This was not his conquest. It was her symphony, and she was the conductor. She turned her head a fraction, so his kiss landed not on her lips, but on her cheekbone, a whisper of contact that was intimate yet denying him full access. She felt him stiffen in confusion. Then she began. She placed her hands on his shoulders, not to pull him closer, but to gently guide him to sit on the edge of the large armchair behind him. He complied, his eyes questioning, watching her as if she were a fascinating, unfamiliar creature. Elara did not join him. Instead, she knelt before him. It was a posture that could have implied submission, but the look in her eyes was one of utter sovereignty. She was not beneath him. She was unveiling him. Her fingers went to the laces of his shoes, slowly, deliberately untying them. She pulled them off, then his socks, her hands smoothing over the arches of his feet in a way that made him suck in a sharp breath. It was an act of such profound, unexpected tenderness that it unmoored him completely. This was not the frantic, goal-oriented sex of his new affair. This was ritual. She looked up at him from her knees, her hands resting on his thighs. "Let me remember you," she whispered, the lie feeling like a sacred vow on her tongue. Every part. And then she began her inventory. Her touch was a historian tracing the map of their shared history. Her lips found the faint, silvery scar on his knee from a long-ago biking accident, a story they still laughed about. Her fingers rediscovered the familiar divot in his shoulder, a knot of stress she had massaged away countless times after difficult days at work. She followed the trail of dark hair on his forearm, a path she knew led to the sensitive spot on his inner wrist. She was not arousing him. She was reassembling him. Piece by piece, memory by memory. She was pulling the man named Marcus away from the stranger who had signed divorce papers and handing him back to himself, the man who belonged to her. Marcus could only watch, his breath coming in ragged pulls. This was not what he had expected. This was a level of intimacy so deep it was almost painful. Cynthia's desire for him was new, exciting, a mirror that flattered his present self. But Elara's touch knew the boy he had been and the man he had become. It was an archaeology of his very soul. He was not making love to his soon-to-be ex-wife. He was being welcomed home. When she finally rose to her feet and led him to their bedroom, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer the one granting a final mercy. He was a follower, a pilgrim at her altar. The room was dim, the bed still unmade from her lonely sleep. She laid him down and continued her reclamation. She used her mouth, her hair, the familiar weight of her body, not in a frantic race toward climax, but as instruments in a slow, devastating composition. She whispered memories in his ear, not of pain or loss, but of joy, of a trip to Venice where they'd made love on a gondola under a bridge, of the time they'd been caught in a summer rainstorm and stumbled laughing into this very room, dripping and desperate for each other. She was erasing Cynthia. She was erasing the lawyer's office. She was erasing everything but the two of them in this primordial space of their own creation. Marcus was utterly, completely lost. The world outside this room ceased to exist. There was only her scent, her skin, the devastatingly familiar yet thrillingly new cadence of her breath. The condom, the agreed-upon symbol of his new life, felt like a distant, irrelevant thought, a scrap of paper from a different reality. He was drowning in Alara, and he had never wanted to come up for air. The careful, controlled narrative of a proper goodbye was in tatters. In its place was something raw, real, and terrifyingly powerful. Alara was unraveling him, thread by thread, and weaving him back together into a man who could not fathom how he had ever decided to leave. The world had shrunk to the confines of their bed, to the familiar scent of their laundry detergent on the sheets, to the rhythm of their synced breathing. Alara had built a fortress of sensation around them, brick by brick, with each touch, each whisper, each rediscovered memory. Marcus was no longer a man leaving. He was a man drowning in the deepest, most intoxicating waters of his past. The condom, that thin, clinical barrier, was a lie in this world of profound truth she had constructed. It was the last stubborn artifact of the outside world, of the man who had signed papers and made promises to another woman. It was the symbol of his intended future, and it had no place in this sacred, stolen present. Alara worked with the precision of a master tactician. She mapped his body not just for pleasure, but for vulnerability. She found the places that made him gasp, the spots that made him groan her name like a prayer. She built the pleasure higher and higher, a towering wave of sensation that crashed over him again and again, each time receding just enough to make him crave the next. She was eroding his will wave by relentless wave. She straddled him, her body a silhouette against the dim light of the room. She leaned down, her hair curtaining their faces, creating a world that contained only the two of them. Her lips found his ear. "Look at me," she breathed, her voice a raw, husky thing that vibrated through his very bones. His eyes, glazed with pleasure, fluttered open. He was utterly captivated, a man beholding a miracle. She held his gaze, her own eyes wide and shimmering with manufactured tears. In them, he didn't see calculation. He saw a depth of feeling so profound it shook him to his core. He saw the ghost of the girl he'd married, the woman he'd loved, the shared history of 15 years. He saw the pain of their ending, and in that moment, he wanted nothing more than to absolve it. "I need to feel you," she whispered, the words a desperate, broken confession. The plea was perfectly timed, perfectly pitched. It wasn't a demand. It was a gift of ultimate intimacy she was begging him to bestow. Not a barrier, not a reminder of why we can't. Just you. One last time. Please, Marcus. The please was the masterstroke. It was the sound of surrender, of vulnerability. It made him the giver, the bestower of this final, sacred connection. It appealed not to his lust, but to his guilt, to his nostalgia, to his crumbling ego. In that suspended second, the battle in his mind was brief and brutally one-sided. The logical voice, the one that screamed of Cynthia, of consequences, of his neatly planned future, was smothered by the tsunami of emotion she had unleashed. The wall she had asked him to build himself, she now asked him to tear down with his own hands. And he wanted to. God, how he wanted to. This wasn't a mistake he was making. It was a tribute he was paying. A final, authentic merging to honor what they were losing. With a groan that was equal parts anguish and ecstasy, his hands moved. It was not a frantic, fumbling act, but a deliberate, conscious one. The thin barrier was removed, cast aside into the darkness of the room, a token sacrifice to the gods of the past. The point of no return was not crossed in a blur of passion. It was crossed with eye contact and a shared, shuddering breath. It was a conscious, mutual step off a cliff. When he entered her, it was with a gasp that was torn from both of them. It was a feeling so shockingly familiar yet utterly new that it felt like the first and last time all at once. It was raw, unprotected, and devastatingly real. It was the truth he had been avoiding for months. For Marcus, it was the culmination of a poignant, heartbreaking farewell. For Elara, it was the successful detonation of her bomb. The fuse had been lit, and there was no going back. The future, their future, was now a terrifying, glorious possibility growing deep within her, and he had just willingly, passionately, provided the final, crucial component. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the frantic hammering of two hearts against two sets of ribs. The air in the room, once thick with the heady perfume of strategy and desire, now felt charged with something else entirely. Something raw, momentous, and terrifyingly real. The act was complete. The gambit had been played. The die, cast into the void by his own hand, was spinning through the darkness, its outcome now a matter of biology and fate. Elara lay beside him, her body thrumming with a potent cocktail of adrenaline, triumph, and a shocking undercurrent of genuine, aching sorrow. The mask she had worn so perfectly felt fused to her skin. She had won. She had orchestrated every second, manipulated every emotion, and achieved her objective with a precision that should have filled her with cold satisfaction. But the echo of his gasp, the shudder that had racked his body and hers, the shocking, barrier-free intimacy of that final connection, it had scraped away a layer of her own artifice. For a few blinding seconds, she too had been lost in the devastating authenticity of it. Marcus did not move. He lay on his back, one arm thrown over his eyes, as if he could not bear to look at the world, or at her, just yet. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Elara held her breath, waiting for the inevitable crash. The regret, the panic, the cold fury of a man realizing he had been masterfully manipulated. She braced for the storm, but when it came, it was not at all what she expected. Slowly, as if the movement caused him physical pain, he lowered his arm from his face. He did not look at her with anger or shock. He looked, shattered, awestruck. His eyes, when they finally found hers in the dim light, were wide, glassy with unshed tears, and filled with a reverence so profound it stole the air from her lungs. He turned on his side to face her, the sheets whispering with the movement. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just beside her cheek, not quite touching, as if she were a holy relic he was afraid to profane. Elara, he breathed, and her name was a prayer on his lips, a sound so broken and full of wonder it felt like a physical touch. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. When he spoke again, his voice was low, ragged, stripped bare of all pretense and ego. It was the most honest sound she had heard from him in years. "My God," he whispered, the words hushed and full of awe. I have never." He paused, searching her face, his own a canvas of stunned disbelief. He seemed to be grappling with a truth so immense he could barely give it voice. That was... He shook his head slowly, a faint, bewildered smile touching his lips, though his eyes remained deadly serious. The best sex of my life." The words landed in the quiet room not as a compliment, but as a confession. A sacred, devastating truth he was offering up to her. It was the ultimate victory. It was the validation of every calculated touch, every whispered memory, every second of her performance. And it broke her heart. For him, it was a tragic epiphany. He had just experienced the most profound intimacy of his life with the woman he was divorcing. He was mourning a connection at the very moment he recognized its true depth. For her, it was victory and heartbreak intertwined. She had won him back to a memory. She had proven her power, but she had done it through a magnificent, soul-crushing lie. The best sex of his life had been a weapon. The reverence in his eyes was for a phantom. She saw the guilt begin to flicker at the edges of his awe, the dawning horror of his betrayal to Cynthia, the crushing weight of the consequence he had so willingly invited. So she did what a master strategist does. She did not let the enemy regroup. Before the guilt could take root, before he could voice the "what have I done?" she saw forming in his eyes. She reached out. She didn't speak. She simply cupped his jaw, her thumb stroking the stubble on his cheek, and drew him to her for a deep, languid, possessive kiss. She swallowed his confession and his impending regret, and she offered him, instead, more. The kiss was a seal. It captured his devastating confession and the first flicker of his panic, holding them both in a suspended, breathless moment. Elara poured everything into it. Not the calculated passion of before, but a newfound, desperate fervor. It was a kiss that said, "This isn't over. Don't you dare let this end." When she finally broke away, Marcus looked dazed, his eyes still swimming with the aftershocks of pleasure and the looming dread of consequence. She saw the struggle on his face, the internal ledger opening as he began to tally the cost of what had just done. "Elara, he began, his voice hoarse, the sentence destined for regret. "Shoo," she murmured, pressing a finger to his lips. Her own smile was soft, languid, a world away from the storm in his eyes. The day is still young. She did not let him retreat into thought. Thought was the enemy. Thought would lead to guilt, to anger, to a frantic dressing and a shameful retreat back to the life he was building with Cynthia. She had to keep him in the labyrinth of sensation she had built, where the walls were made of memory and the only exit was through her. She rose from the bed, a vision of serene power in the soft light. "I'm starving," she declared, as if they were in the midst of a lazy weekend, not the aftermath of a world-shattering encounter. "And I know you are too." She held out her hand. After a moment's hesitation, he took it, his larger hand engulfing hers. She led him, naked and vulnerable, from the bedroom, across the hall, and into the kitchen. The domestic normalcy of it was jarring, a surreal contrast to the intensity they had just left behind. She moved around the kitchen with a familiar ease, pulling bread, cheese, and fruit from the refrigerator. She poured 2 glasses of rich, red wine, ignoring the hour. Rules no longer applied in this liminal space. She fed him a strawberry, her fingertips brushing his lips, and the simple act felt more intimate than anything that had come before. They ate at the kitchen island, their knees touching. She talked, her voice a low, soothing melody. She did not speak of the future or the past. She spoke of nothing, of the sweetness of the fruit, the boldness of the wine, the way the light slanted through the window. She built a bubble of perfect, present-tense contentment around them. And then, when she saw the tension finally leave his shoulders, when his smile became less strained and more genuine, she took his hand again and led him back to the bedroom. The second time was different. It was slower, more exploratory. The frantic energy of the last time was gone, replaced by a curious, lingering rediscovery. Without the precipice of a final goodbye looming, Marcus seemed to truly see her, to touch her not as a memory, but as the astonishingly present reality. He was the one who mapped the curve of her spine, who whispered a memory of his own. A time Shed laughed so hard Shed snorted, and how had fallen in love with her all over again in that moment. Elara felt a dangerous lurch in her chest. This was not part of the plan. The plan was about strategy, about leveraging history. It was not about feeling the ghost of the love that had once lived here. She pushed the emotion down, channeling it into her physical response, using it to fuel the fantasy. She kept him there for hours. In the bed, in the bath, once more in the bed. She was a siren weaving a song of comfort and addictive pleasure. She blurred the lines until there was no divorce, no Cynthia, no empty nursery. There was only the sun moving across the floor, the taste of wine on their tongues, and the profound, echoing rightness of their bodies fitting together. When the evening light began to fade, painting the room in shades of orange and gray, the real world began to intrude. His phone, silenced in the pocket of the jeans discarded hours ago on the floor, buzzed insistently. Once, twice, the spell fractured. Marcus flinched as if struck. The languid, satiated expression on his face evaporated, replaced by a swift, sickening dread. He didn't have to look. They both knew who it was. The labyrinth walls, so solid moments before, turned to mist. Elara saw the exit appear in his eyes, and she knew she could not stop him from taking it. Not today. He rose from the bed without a word and began to dress, his movements stiff and hurried, his back to her. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was heavy and suffocating. The guilt she had held at bay for hours now crashed over him in a visible wave. He left without looking back, without another kiss, without a goodbye. The front door clicked shut with a soft, final sound. Elara lay in the quiet, the scent of him still on her skin, on the sheets. The house was silent once more, but it was a different silence. It was no longer a tomb. It was a field after a battle, waiting to see what would take root. She had kept him in the labyrinth until he forgot the way out. Now she had to wait and see if he would ever try to find his way back. The click of the front door was a full stop. The symphony of sensation Elara had conducted for hours ended not with a crescendo, but with that single, quiet, definitive sound. For a long time she did not move. She lay in the wreckage of their bed, the sheets tangled and smelling of him, of sex, of wine, and of her own expensive perfume. The fading evening light bled from orange to deep purple to a velvety, impenetrable blue, casting long shadows that crept across the room like silent observers. The adrenaline that had fueled her, the laser-focused concentration that had held the entire performance together, evaporated, leaving her feeling hollowed out and strangely numb. She was a master strategist after the battle, surveying a field where the outcome was unknown. She had deployed every weapon in her arsenal. The campaign was over. Now there was only the waiting. She replayed the day in her mind, not with emotion, but with a cold, analytical eye. The hesitation at the door, the calculated request, the strategic acceptance of his condition, the meticulous unraveling of his resolve. The precise moment he chose her, chose them over the sterile future he had planned. His confession, raw and reverent, echoed in the silent room. The best sex of my life. It had worked. Every single step had worked exactly as she had envisioned it in her despair on the nursery floor. So why did she feel this hollow ache in the center of her chest? She finally rose, her body sore in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. She walked to the bathroom and turned on the shower, steaming up the mirror before she could catch her own reflection. She didn't want to see the woman who had just done what she had done. Under the scalding water, she scrubbed at her skin, as if she could wash away the layers of performance and emerge as someone else. But the scent of him seemed to have seeped into her pores. The days that followed were a study in suspended animation. The house, which had so recently been a stage, was now a waiting room. She moved through it like a ghost, performing the mundane rituals of life on autopilot. She made tea she didn't drink. She turned pages of books she didn't read. She slept fitfully in the center of the large bed, never venturing to his cold, empty side. She did not call him. She did not text. This was the most crucial part of the strategy. The silence. She had given him an experience so potent it had to be processed in isolation. Any contact from her would be a tether to the guilt and complexity of that day, giving him an excuse to blame her, to dismiss it as a moment of shared madness. Her silence, however, was a void. It forced him to sit in the dissonance. It forced him to confront the memory without her influence, to compare the haunting, profound intimacy they had shared to whatever he had with Cynthia. She knew him. He would be wrestling with it. The guilt would be a physical weight on him. He would be short with Cynthia, distracted at work, his mind constantly drifting back to the twilight in the kitchen, the taste of wine and strawberries, the feel of her skin. A week passed, then another. The silence was a thick fog around her. She began to watch her body with a hawk-like intensity. She was waiting for a sign, for a shift, for the first whisper of confirmation that her audacious gamble had paid the ultimate dividend. And then it came, not with drama, but with a subtle, insidious unease. A wave of nausea that washed over her one morning as she was brushing her teeth. So sudden and visceral it left her gripping the sink, her knuckles white. It passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a tremor of possibility. A few days later, a profound, bone-deep exhaustion descended in the middle of the afternoon. So heavy she had to curl up on the couch and sleep for 2 hours as if she had been drugged. Her body was changing. The signs were faint, whispers in a language only she was listening for, but they were there. Hope, a feeling she had forcibly excised from her heart, began to knock softly, tentatively on its doors. She still did not call him. The silence was now a sacred space, a cocoon where her potential future was growing, cell by cell. She would not disrupt it. She would wait. She would watch. And she would prepare for the next move. The battle was won, but the war for their future was just beginning. The silence stretched into a third week, becoming a tangible presence in the house. Elara had become an archaeologist of her own body, excavating every sensation for meaning. The nausea was no longer a passing wave. It was a tide, rising each morning with a brutal, predictable rhythm. The exhaustion was a leaden weight sewn into her bones. Her breasts were tender in a way that was achingly familiar yet entirely new, a sensation that sent a jolt of both hope and fear through her each time she moved too quickly. She had stopped drinking coffee. The smell alone was enough to send her rushing to the bathroom. She found herself staring at the fruit bowl, her stomach turning at the thought of anything but the blandest crackers. These were not whispers anymore. They were declarations. She could wait no longer. The trip to the pharmacy was a study in surreal normalcy. She moved through the brightly lit aisles, a ghost among the living, her heart hammering against her ribs. She picked up the box with hands that threatened to tremble, her gaze skittering away from the cashier's eyes as she paid. Felt like buying a state secret. At home, she placed the unopened box on the bathroom counter and simply stared at it. This small, plastic rectangle held the power to validate her most desperate act, to make her a monster or a miracle worker, could make her a mother. She waited for the morning, as the instructions dictated. The night was endless. She lay awake, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, trying to feel something, anything, beyond the churning anxiety. She thought of Marcus, wondering where he was, who he was with, if his guilt had hardened into resentment or if the memory of their afternoon still haunted him. She was fighting a war on two fronts, one within her own body, and one in the mind of a man miles away. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, she rose. The house was cloaked in a profound, waiting silence. She did not turn on any lights. She carried the test into the bathroom and closed the door, shutting herself in with her fate. The process was clinical, familiar from years of heartbreaking repetition. But this time was different. This time, there was no desperate, clawing hope. There was only a cold, terrifying certainty. She set the test on a square of toilet paper on the edge of the sink and set the timer on her phone. 3 minutes, 180 seconds. She did not pace. She did not pray. She stood perfectly still, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the digital numbers count down. She watched her reflection in the dark mirror, a pale, solemn woman in the pre-dawn gloom, on the cusp of forever. The phone buzzed, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Her eyes snapped from her reflection to the plastic stick. For a long moment, she didn't move. She didn't breathe. She simply absorbed the sight. 2 lines. Not a faint maybe. Not a ghost of a line that required tilting toward the light and squinting until her eyes crossed. 2 bold, unmistakable, blue lines. They were a verdict, a sentence, a miracle. A sound escaped her. A half-gasp, half-sob that was choked off before it could fully form. She reached out a hand that was now trembling violently and picked up the test, bringing it close to her face as if to confirm its reality. The 2 lines remained, solid, unwavering. A quiet, seismic shift occurred within her. The calculated general, the heartbroken wife, the cunning siren. All those selves dissolved. In their place was something primal, fierce, and utterly still. All the noise in her head, The guilt, the strategy, the fear simply vanished, replaced by a profound, humming certainty. She placed a protective hand on her stomach, a gesture that was no longer a performance for an audience of one, but the most authentic act of her life. "Hello, my love," she whispered into the silent, sacred space. The words were not a greeting, but a vow, promise, acclaiming. She did not cry. She did not jump for joy. She stood there for a long time, in the quiet of the dawn, holding the test and feeling the world rearrange itself around those two blue lines. The war was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But she had won the beachhead. The future was no longer a concept. It was a cell, dividing and multiplying deep within her. She had her confirmation. Now she needed his. The two blue lines did not grant Alara peace. They granted her purpose. The silent, waiting vigil was over. Now was the time for action. But action required strategy, and strategy required confirmation beyond the oracle of a drugstore test. She booked the doctor's appointment with a voice so steady it surprised even her. In the stark, sterile clinic, she submitted to blood draws and ultrasounds with a detached calm. When the doctor, a kind-faced woman with a gentle smile, confirmed the result. "You are most definitely pregnant, Alara. Congratulations." She simply nodded. The word congratulations felt alien, a sentiment from a different universe. This was not a joy. It was a mission objective, successfully acquired. The grainy, black and white sonogram photo she was given was not a cherished first picture for a baby book. It was evidence, the most powerful ammunition she would ever possess. She did not call Marcus immediately. She let the image sit on her kitchen counter for 2 days, a tiny, cryptic monolith on the polished granite. She studied the blurry, bean-shaped shadow, this tiny, impossible thing that was the physical manifestation of her will. She needed to be utterly steeled for what was to come. When she finally called him, her voice was light, neutral, a masterclass in composure. "Marcus, hi. I found a few more things of yours. Thought you might want them. Maybe we could grab a coffee?" She suggested a public place, a bright, modern cafe they had never frequented together. Neutral territory. No ghosts, no memories to cloud the issue. She needed him off balance, without the comforting, familiar scripts of their shared history. She arrived first, choosing a table near the back. She wore a simple, elegant sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back. She looked healthy, calm, and utterly in control. She placed her purse on the table, the sonogram hidden inside like a sealed verdict. He arrived looking like a man who had not slept well in weeks. He was thinner, his suit jacket seeming to hang on him. There was a new tension around his eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there before. He offered her a strained smile as he sat down. "Alara, you look well," he said, the pleasantry sounding hollow. "Thank you. You look tired," she replied, not unkindly. It was a simple statement of fact that hung between them, acknowledging the elephant in the room without naming it. He ordered an espresso, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the table. He spoke first, filling the awkward silence with the script she knew he would use. He talked about being busy, about the complexities of moving, about apartment hunting. Then, almost apologetically, he mentioned Cynthia. She likes a very modern aesthetic. Lots of light. Nice. He was trying to convince himself. Alara could hear it in the hollow enthusiasm of his voice. She simply listened, sipping her herbal tea, letting him talk himself into a corner, letting him build the new life he thought he wanted, brick by fragile brick. When he finally paused, taking a sip of his bitter coffee, she saw her opening. The space he had created for his new narrative was now perfectly hollowed out, ready for her to demolish it. "I'm glad you're settling in," she said, her voice still soft, still neutral. She reached into her purse, her movements slow and deliberate. "Like I said, I found a few things I thought you should have." He looked expectant, perhaps thinking of a forgotten book or a stray photo. Instead, she slid the small, rectangular sonogram picture across the smooth surface of the table. It came to a rest between his coffee cup and her tea. Marcus stared at it, uncomprehending. His brain, still buzzing with talk of minimalist apartments and Cynthia's taste, could not process the image. It was an abstract medical Rorschach test. Then his focus sharpened. His eyes tracked the white, blurry outline, the label with her name and a date, the unmistakable form of a gestational sac. The blood drained from his face so completely he looked gray. His hand, which had been drumming the table, froze mid-tap. His eyes shot to hers, wide with a shock so profound it was almost childlike. Confusion, denial, and a dawning, terrifying realization cycled like a frantic zoetrope in his gaze. How? He choked out, the word a dry rasp. His voice was barely a whisper. I. His sentence fractured, unable to form around the memory he was desperately trying to reassemble. The heat, the passion, the agreement, the moment of deliberate, conscious removal. The memory of his own recklessness, his own passionate compliance, came rushing back, and with it, the horrifying understanding of the consequence. It was not a trick. It was a result. His result. Alara did not smile. She did not gloat. She met his horrified gaze with a preternatural calm. She let the silence stretch, let him feel the full, crushing weight of it. It seems, she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear it, each word falling into the silence with the weight of a stone. We were blessed in our goodbye. The words were a perfectly crafted masterpiece. They held no accusation. They held no plea. They simply stated a fact, wrapping it in the poignant, tragic narrative of their final afternoon that he himself had sanctified with his confession. The best sex of my life had just been given its lasting form. Marcus stared at the grainy image, then back at her, his world tilting on its axis, shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The new life he had so carefully planned with Cynthia suddenly seemed flimsy, insubstantial, a dollhouse next to the shocking, profound reality of the child he and Alara had created, the child they had prayed for a decade. The divorce, which had seemed so final, was suddenly just a piece of paper. The silence at the cafe table was no longer awkward. It was cataclysmic. Marcus did not move. He simply stared at the sonogram, his face a pale, rigid mask of shock. The grainy image seemed to hold a gravitational pull, sucking all the light and sound from the world around them. Alara could almost see the calculations firing behind his eyes, the frantic, failing attempts to find an exit that did not exist. Finally, with a hand that trembled slightly, he reached out and picked up the tiny photograph. He held it gingerly, as if it were made of glass and might shatter, or as if it might burn him. "This is," he began, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat, trying to muster authority, logic, denial. "Alara, this is impossible. We were careful." The last word was a desperate plea. He looked at her, begging her to agree, to tell him it was a mistake, a cruel joke. She met his gaze, her own expression one of serene, unshakable certainty. "We were," she agreed softly, her tone implying a shared, tragic irony. "Until we weren't. Do you not remember?" The question was a precision strike. It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation to relive the moment with her, the moment he had sanctified as the most profound of his life. She saw the memory flash in his eyes, the dim light of the bedroom, her whispered plea, his own conscious, deliberate choice. His face crumpled, the last vestige of denial evaporating. He remembered. He dropped the sonogram on the table as if it had grown hot and shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. A few people at nearby tables glanced over. He didn't seem to notice. I need air. I need to think." He fled the cafe without a backward glance, leaving his half-finished espresso and the evidence of his future sitting on the table. Alara did not follow him. She did not call after him. She calmly picked up the sonogram, tucked it back into her purse, and finished her tea. The battle was now his to fight within himself. The following days were a tempest contained within the walls of Marcus' new, minimalist apartment. Cynthia's understanding, which had once felt like a bomb, now felt like a superficial salve on a gaping wound. Her modern aesthetic, which he had praised to Alara, now felt cold and sterile, a blank canvas that offered no answers. He tried to broach the subject once, his words halting and clumsy. "Cynthia, something has happened." With Alara. Cynthia's face, usually so open and encouraging, tightened immediately. What? What could possibly have happened? "Marcus, it's over. You signed the papers." He took a breath, the words sticking in his throat. "She's pregnant." The silence that followed was different from Alara's potent quiet. This was a cold, furious silence. Cynthia's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Pregnant?" She repeated, the word flat and disbelieving. "How? You told me it was over between you. You told me you hadn't." "It was a mistake," he said, the explanation sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "One time. A goodbye." "A goodbye?" Her laugh was sharp, incredulous. "It sounds like a hell of a hello to me, Marcus." She crossed her arms, her body language shifting from open to fortified. "This is a trick. It has to be. It's a desperate move to get you back." "It's not a trick," he said, the memory of the sonogram, the undeniable clinical proof, burning in his mind. "I saw the ultrasound." Cynthia's reaction was not one of compassionate understanding. It was one of pragmatic, wounded fury. "So what? What does that change? You left her. You left her for a reason. This doesn't fix what was broken. It just makes it more complicated." Her voice rose, laced with a panic that mirrored his own. "It's a mistake, Marcus. A trick. You can't possibly be considering." Considering. The word hung in the air. That was the heart of it. He was considering. He was thinking about the child he and Alara had wanted for so long. The ghost that had haunted their marriage was now a reality. The shiny, uncomplicated future with Cynthia suddenly seemed like a life built on a foundation of sand next to the monumental, complicated truth growing in Alara's womb. Cynthia saw the conflict on his face, the hesitation where she needed certainty. Her understanding, it turned out, had very clear limits. Her love was conditional upon a future that did not include the shadow of his ex-wife and child. "You need to decide, Marcus," she said, her voice turning cold and final. "You can have that life, that past, that mess, or you can have this life. With me. You can't have both." The ultimatum was the clarifying moment he didn't know he needed. It was clean, sharp, and utterly devoid of the profound, messy history that tied him to Alara. Cynthia's love demanded he choose a future unburdened. Alara was the future. She was the consequence, the history, and the miracle, all inextricably intertwined. He ended it with Cynthia that night. The conversation was messy, full of tears and accusations that he knew were justified. He was the villain in her story, and he accepted it. When he walked out of the sleek apartment, it felt less like leaving a home and more like being released from a very beautiful, very empty waiting room. He didn't go to Alara immediately. He drove around for hours, until the city lights blurred into streaks of gold. He had no answers, no grand plan. He was a man who had torn down his new life in a single day. Finally, out of options, out of energy, he found his car pointed toward the only place that had ever truly been home. He showed up on Alara's doorstep in the middle of the night, unshaven, his clothes rumpled, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and guilt. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable in the porch light. He didn't have a speech. He had nothing to offer but a shattered question, a plea for a chance to fix the unfixable. "Can I?" he whispered, his voice raw. "Can we try?" Alara stood in the doorway, the chill of the night air washing over her. Marcus was a silhouette of pure exhaustion against the darkness, his question hanging between them like the faint mist of his breath. "Can we try?" She did not answer immediately. She studied him, the rumpled clothes, the shadow of a beard, the eyes hollowed out by guilt and sleepless nights. This was not the triumphant return of a conquering hero. This was the bedraggled surrender of a soldier who had finally realized he was on the wrong side of the war. It was exactly what she had wanted. And yet, The sight of him so broken stirred something complicated and unwelcome within her. A remnant of the love that had started it all, now twisted by strategy and grief. She stepped back, a silent invitation. He crossed the threshold, and the door clicked shut behind him, sealing them in the quiet dimness of the entryway. The house seemed to hold its breath. The papers, he began, his voice raspy. The divorce. We can stop it. I'll call the lawyer tomorrow. Alara shook her head slowly. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. That's not how this begins again, Marcus. He looked at her, confused, a fresh wave of panic in his eyes. Had he misread this? Had she changed her mind? The papers are a symptom, she continued, crossing her arms over her chest, over the life growing within it, not the disease. We don't just rip them up and pretend the sickness is gone. We start from here. Now, with this, she placed a hand on her stomach, the gesture now one of definition. We build something new, on top of the ruins. There was no grand ceremony, no rewriting of vows in front of friends and family. Their renewal was a quieter, deeper, more arduous thing. It began the next morning when he showed up with a duffel bag, his expression tentative. It was forged in the daily, unglamorous work of rebuilding. It was in the way he held her hair back the next time morning sickness overwhelmed her. His touch hesitant at first, then becoming sure and steady. It was in the way he instinctively learned the new geography of her body. His hand finding her growing belly when they slept, not in passion, but in a protective, awestruck habit. It was in the silent, shared glances over breakfast when a wave of nausea would hit, a look that now held a shared knowledge instead of a shared sorrow. The shadow of infertility, which had been a cold third presence in their marriage for so long, was replaced by the vibrant, kicking reality of their miracle. One evening, as they sat reading on the couch, he placed his hand on her stomach and felt the unmistakable, fluttering kick. His eyes shot to hers, wide with a wonder so pure it brought tears to them both. For the first time, the future was not a desperate hope, but a tangible life asserting itself. He never spoke of that afternoon again, but sometimes he would look at her, radiant and powerful in her motherhood, her cunning hidden behind a serene smile, and a shiver of awe would pass through him. He saw the fierce love that had literally created life from the ashes of their despair. He didn't see the manipulation. He saw the desperation of a woman who had refused to let her family die. He saw a strength that left him humbled. They did not forget. The scars of his betrayal and her calculated seduction were woven into the new fabric of their relationship, a permanent texture reminding them of how fragile it all was. But the shared focus on the life they had created, the child they had both wanted so desperately, became the bridge over that chasm. One afternoon, while painting the nursery, a soft, warm gray this time, Marcus put down his brush and looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were simple, but they were the first that addressed the old wound directly. They weren't about the pregnancy or the divorce. They were about the loneliness, the distance, the failure that had driven him away. Alara looked at him, a paintbrush in her hand. She nodded slowly, accepting the apology not as absolution, but as a necessary brick in their new foundation. "I know," she said, and then, after a pause, "So am I." They never got back what they had. What they built was different, stronger in some ways, more fragile in others. It was a marriage aware of its own capacity for breaking, and therefore more fiercely protective of its mending. The family they had once only dreamed of was no longer a forgotten promise. It was a living, breathing reality, kicking impatiently in the next room, waiting to be born. Their story had not ended with a goodbye. It had been renewed with a heartbeat.